Congratulations, Mr. Whitmore. You now own everything. The judge's voice echoed across the polished courtroom, sharp and final, the kind of sound that seals a life in place. And Daniel Whitmore smiled like a man who had just won a $12 million game he'd been playing for years, his tailored navy suit catching the overhead lights, his fingers resting confidently on the mahogany table as if the entire room belonged to him. And maybe it did, at least for a moment, because the ruling was clear: the house in Westchester, the investment accounts, the company shares, even the vintage car collection, all transferred. All his. Every asset Naomi Carter once touched now signed away with a single stroke of ink. And people in the gallery leaned toward each other whispering quietly, because to them this was simple: another wealthy man walking away clean, another quiet wife disappearing into nothing. But Naomi didn't disappear. She stood there, still as marble, her hands folded, her expression unreadable, not broken, not angry, just calm. And that calm made no sense. Not to the lawyers, not to the spectators, and definitely not to Daniel, who finally glanced at her, expecting tears, expecting regret, expecting something he could recognize. But she only met his eyes for a second, and in that second something shifted, something too small to name but too sharp to ignore. Then she looked away, like the outcome had never mattered in the first place. And that was the first crack in the story no one else noticed, because 3 months earlier, Naomi Carter had been sitting alone in a quiet kitchen, her laptop glowing in the dim light. A single email open on the screen with no sender name, no signature, just a subject line that didn't belong in any marriage. You don't know what he's been hiding. And she had stared at those words for a long time, long enough for the coffee in her hand to go cold, long enough for doubt to turn into something heavier, something sharper. And when she finally clicked the attachment, what she found wasn't just numbers. It was patterns, accounts that didn't line up, companies that existed on paper but nowhere else, transfers that moved like shadows across state lines, and one name tied to all of it: Daniel Whitmore. And in that moment the man she thought she knew began to separate into two versions: the one who smiled at charity events and the one buried in documents no one was supposed to see. And most people would have panicked. Most people would have confronted him, demanded answers. But Naomi didn't. She closed the laptop slowly, her reflection staring back at her in the dark screen, and she whispered something so quiet no one else would ever hear it. "Then I'll let him have it." And from that moment on everything changed. Not on the surface, not where anyone could see, but underneath, where decisions are made that don't need witnesses, where silence becomes strategy. And by the time Daniel filed for divorce, convinced he was taking control, Naomi had already decided exactly how much she was willing to lose, and more importantly, exactly what he was about to take. Because some victories only look like victories when you don't know the full cost. And as the judge's gavel settled and the courtroom exhaled, Daniel Whitmore believed he had just secured his future. He just didn't realize he had also signed his name onto something else entirely. The courtroom doors had barely closed when Daniel Whitmore's phone began to vibrate nonstop. A steady pulse of notifications that felt like applause at first. Congratulations from colleagues. Messages from his attorney confirming the transfer of assets. Confirmations that every account, every holding, every title had officially shifted into his name. And he walked down the courthouse steps with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had just secured the rest of his life. The crisp afternoon air in Manhattan sharp against his face as cameras flashed somewhere in the distance. Not for him, but it felt like they could have been. Because this was his moment, his clean break, his perfect exit. And behind him Naomi Carter stepped out quietly, unnoticed, her heels tapping softly against the stone, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward like someone who had already finished what she came to do. And Daniel did not look back, not once, because in his mind there was nothing left to see, nothing left to take. But later that evening, when he sat alone in his newly acquired penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, a space that now legally belonged to him in every sense, the silence began to feel different, heavier somehow, as he opened the first set of financial documents his legal team had forwarded. Pages of numbers, ownership transfers, confirmations, everything exactly as expected, until it was not, because buried deep in the structure of the companies he now controlled were details he had never personally reviewed before, layers of transactions that seemed routine at a glance, but began to unravel the longer he stared, and Daniel prided himself on being meticulous, on understanding every corner of his empire. But this felt unfamiliar, like reading a language he should know but suddenly could not fully translate. And across town, Naomi sat at a small kitchen table in an apartment she had quietly leased under a different name weeks earlier, a single lamp casting a warm glow over a stack of neatly organized folders, each labeled, each precise, each piece of a puzzle she had been assembling long before the divorce papers were ever filed, and she moved through them slowly, not with urgency, but with certainty, as if checking a list that had already been completed, because for her this was never about winning in the courtroom. It was about timing, about letting events unfold exactly as they needed to. And 3 months earlier, when that anonymous email first arrived, she had not just discovered hidden accounts. She had uncovered a pattern of decisions Daniel believed were invisible, transactions routed through layers designed to obscure responsibility, structures built to protect him from scrutiny, but structures only work until ownership becomes clear, until everything points to a single name. And Naomi had understood something in that moment that Daniel never considered. That control is not just about what you keep. It is about what you accept, what you sign for, what you claim as yours without question. And so she had made herself smaller in the process, quieter, more agreeable, allowing his confidence to grow unchecked, allowing his legal team to push harder, to demand more, to take everything, because every demand they made brought them closer to the one outcome she needed: full transfer, full ownership, no shared liability, no divided control. Just one name on every line. And now, as Daniel flipped through another document, his brow tightening slightly, that name stared back at him again and again. Daniel Whitmore, sole owner, sole authority, sole responsibility. And for the first time since the judge's ruling, the word everything began to feel less like a victory and more like a question he had not thought to ask, because somewhere between what he believed he had taken and what had actually been handed to him, something did not add up, and Naomi, sitting quietly in the soft light of her new space, already knew exactly when he would start to understand why. The next morning arrived too quietly for a man who believed he had just won everything, and Daniel Whitmore noticed it before he understood it, the kind of silence that does not celebrate but waits, as sunlight stretched across the glass walls of his penthouse and reflected off stacks of documents he had barely slept through reviewing, each page pulling him deeper into something he could not yet define. Because what began as routine confirmations had turned into questions, small at first, almost insignificant. Why were certain subsidiaries structured in ways he had never approved? Why did some accounts show transfers that bypassed his usual oversight? And more importantly, why was everything now tied directly and exclusively to his name, without the buffers he had always relied on? And Daniel was not careless. He built his reputation on precision, on knowing exactly where every dollar came from and where it went. But this felt different, like stepping into a house he thought he owned only to realize he had never seen all the rooms. And across the city, Naomi Carter folded a single piece of paper and placed it into an envelope, her movements unhurried, deliberate, the kind of calm that comes from finishing something long before anyone else realizes it has even begun. Because what Daniel was experiencing now was not an accident, it was timing. The slow reveal of a structure she had carefully allowed him to step into, piece by piece, signature by signature, until there was no separation left between him and everything he believed he controlled. And 3 months earlier, when she first followed the trail hidden inside those digital files, she had not reacted with fear. She had studied it, mapped it, understood how layers that once protected him could become the very thing that exposed him once ownership shifted completely. And that understanding had changed the way she moved through every conversation that followed, every legal meeting, every negotiation. Because while Daniel pushed for more, she agreed. While his attorney demanded full control, she signed. While everyone expected resistance, she gave none. And that absence of resistance became the most dangerous move of all, because it removed every reason for them to look closer, every reason to question why someone would walk away so easily from what appeared to be everything. And now, as Daniel sat at his desk, his phone lighting up again with messages that no longer sounded like congratulations but requests, clarifications, Urgent questions from advisors who had begun to notice the same inconsistencies he was staring at. A single email stood out among the rest, flagged high priority from a compliance officer he barely knew. Subject line simple and direct. Immediate review required. And for the first time his confidence hesitated, just slightly, just enough to feel the shift beneath him. Because victories are supposed to feel stable. They are supposed to bring certainty. But this felt like standing on something that moved when it should not. And he leaned back in his chair, staring out at the river, trying to piece together where control had started to slip, not realizing that it had never slipped at all. It had been handed to him in exactly the way Naomi intended, complete, undeniable, and irreversible. And as she sealed the envelope and set it aside, her reflection steady in the window beside her, she did not smile, she did not celebrate, because this was not about watching him fall. It was about something quieter, something colder, the moment a person begins to understand that what they fought to take may never have belonged to them in the way they believed. And somewhere between the documents on his desk and the questions he could no longer ignore, Daniel Whitmore was getting closer to that realization with every passing minute. By mid-afternoon, the shift could no longer be ignored because Daniel Whitmore was no longer reading documents. He was chasing answers, and every answer led to something he did not like. The compliance email opened into a chain of flagged transactions, each one requiring clarification, each one tied to entities now fully under his name. And as he scrolled, his jaw tightened, not from panic, but from recognition, because he had seen structures like this before, not in his own files, but in cases discussed behind closed doors in boardrooms, where people spoke carefully about exposure and distance, about how risk could be distributed across layers so no single person carried the full weight. And yet here it was assembled differently, not distributed, not shared, but concentrated. And for the first time a question formed clearly in his mind: why would anyone design it this way? And across the city, Naomi Carter sat in a quiet office space she had rented weeks earlier, the walls bare, the desk minimal, a single folder open in front of her labeled in clean, precise lettering timeline. And she traced a finger down the page, not to read, but to confirm what she already knew. Dates lined up, transfers aligned, signatures matched exactly as planned, because nothing in this moment was unfolding by chance, it was unfolding by design. And 3 months earlier, when she had followed the digital trail far enough to understand its shape, she had realized something that changed everything. Daniel believed complexity protected him, but complexity only protects when control is shared, and the moment control becomes singular, the entire structure changes meaning. Every hidden layer, every indirect path, every quiet decision becomes a direct line back to one name. And that name now sat printed across every document on his desk. And back in the penthouse, Daniel stood and walked toward the window, the city stretching below him, steady, unchanged, indifferent to whatever storm was beginning to form inside his carefully ordered world. His phone rang again, this time not a message, not an alert, but a call, and he answered immediately, his tone measured, controlled, but the voice on the other end did not mirror his calm. It was tight, professional, urgent. We need to review ownership exposure immediately. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Exposure to what he asked, though part of him already understood. The pause on the line was brief, but heavy. Everything came, the reply, and the word hung there longer than it should have, because everything was supposed to be the reward, not the risk. And Daniel turned back toward the desk, the documents now spread wider than before, no longer neat, no longer orderly, but revealing patterns. He could not ignore patterns that pointed not outward, not toward partners or intermediaries, but inward toward him alone. And somewhere in that realization, a second question surfaced, quieter, but far more dangerous. When did this change? Because he did not remember authorizing this level of consolidation. He did not remember removing the layers that once separated him from the core. And yet the signatures were there, his signatures, dated, verified, undeniable. And across town, Naomi closed the folder gently, her reflection faint in the glass surface of the desk. And for a moment she allowed herself to sit in the silence, not to celebrate, but to observe the timing, because this was the exact point she had calculated, the moment when certainty begins to fracture, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, precise breaks that spread until the whole structure can no longer hold. And she reached for her phone, scrolling briefly before stopping on a single contact, not saved with a name, just a number she had never called before, not yet. And she did not press it, she simply looked at it for a second longer, then locked the screen. and set it down because there was no need to rush. The next step would not come from her. It would come from the weight of everything Daniel had chosen to take, and as he stood there, surrounded by proof that felt increasingly unfamiliar, the victory he had carried out of the courtroom began to shift into something else, something he could not define, but could no longer dismiss. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when everything falls apart, it is when you realize it was never stable to begin with. The call ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than anything that had been said, and Daniel Whitmore remained standing in the center of his penthouse, staring at the reflection of himself in the darkened glass, because something inside that reflection no longer matched the version of the man who had walked out of the courtroom just hours earlier, confident, controlled, certain, and now that certainty had begun to fracture, not visibly, not dramatically, but in small, precise ways that he could not ignore. The documents on his desk were no longer just confirmations, they were evidence of something he had never agreed to, or at least never realized he had agreed to, and that distinction mattered more than anything, because agreement requires awareness, and awareness was exactly what he was starting to question. He moved back to the desk, flipping through another set of files, faster now, less composed, searching for something familiar, something that reassured him this was still his system, still his design, but every page told the same story: ownership, complete authority, absolute responsibility, and no separation, no buffer, no distance between him and the core of everything. And that was when the memory surfaced, not as a clear moment, but as a sequence, small decisions, conversations he had barely paid attention to at the time, legal drafts pushed across tables, clauses adjusted, language simplified. Naomi sitting quietly beside him during early negotiations, her voice calm, almost detached, when she said she would not contest certain terms, that she just wanted it to be over, and he had accepted that without question, because it made things easier, because it aligned with what he wanted, because it confirmed the narrative he believed, that she was stepping away, that she was giving up, that she did not understand the full scope of what she was signing away. And now, sitting there with every asset tied directly to him, he realized something that did not fit that narrative at all. She had understood exactly what she was doing, and across the city, Naomi Carter stood by the window of her small office space, watching the late afternoon light shift across the buildings, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady. Because this moment, this exact moment, had always been part of the sequence, not the end, not the climax, just the point where awareness begins, where the illusion of control starts to dissolve under its own weight. She reached for the envelope she had prepared earlier, running her fingers lightly along its edge before placing it carefully into her bag, not rushing, not hesitating, because timing was not about speed, it was about precision. And everything so far had unfolded exactly as planned. Back in the penthouse, Daniel's phone vibrated again, another call, this time from his attorney, and he answered immediately, his voice sharper, now less controlled. "We need to talk," the attorney said, without greeting. "There are concerns about how these assets are structured." "Concerns?" Daniel repeated, his tone tightening. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that do not go away." The reply came quickly, and for the first time, there was no professional distance in the voice, only urgency. "Everything is under your name, Daniel. Every liability, every exposure. If there is a review, if anyone looks closely, it all leads back to you." Daniel did not respond right away, because the words were no longer abstract. They were aligning with what he was already seeing, what he was already beginning to understand. And the question he had asked himself earlier returned stronger now, clearer. When did this change? Except now the answer was starting to form, not in a single moment, but across all the moments. He had dismissed all the details, he had overlooked all the signatures he had placed without hesitation, because they benefited him, because they gave him everything. And as that realization settled, something colder replaced the uncertainty, not panic, not fear, but recognition, the kind that arrives when a pattern becomes undeniable. And for the first time since the divorce, Daniel Whitmore was no longer thinking about what he had gained, he was thinking about what he had accepted. And across town, Naomi stepped out into the evening air, the envelope secure in her bag, the city moving around her, unaware of the quiet shift that had already begun, because sometimes the most powerful move is not taking something away, it is allowing someone to take exactly what they asked for, and nothing more. It happened the next morning at exactly 9:12 a.m., when the illusion finally cracked in a way Daniel Whitmore could not ignore, because this time it was not a document, not a pattern, not a quiet inconsistency buried in paperwork. It was a knock, sharp, controlled, unmistakable, echoing through the space he now owned completely, and for a brief Second, he stood still, as if the sound itself required interpretation, as if there could be another explanation for why it felt different from every other interruption in his life. But there was none, and when he opened the door, the hallway seemed narrower than usual, the air heavier, and the people standing there did not smile, did not introduce themselves with pleasantries, did not offer congratulations. They spoke clearly, professionally, and directly, asking for his time, requesting access, referencing documentation that matched exactly what he had been reviewing the night before. And Daniel listened carefully, because he always listened carefully, but this time the words did not land as information, they landed as confirmation that whatever had been unfolding inside those files was no longer contained. It had stepped outside into the real world, into his space, into his name, and across the city Naomi Carter was already seated at a quiet table. In a small office downtown, her bag resting beside her, the envelope still sealed, her posture calm, not tense, not expectant, because she had already passed the point of uncertainty. Everything from here forward was simply sequence. She glanced once at the clock, not because she was waiting, but because she understood timing down to the minute. And back in the penthouse, Daniel stepped aside, allowing the conversation to move forward. The tone remained professional, the language precise, but there was no mistaking the shift in control. This was no longer his environment, no longer his narrative, and as questions were asked, as clarifications were requested, as specific entities and transactions were named, something became undeniably clear. Every path, every layer, every decision led back to him, not partially, not indirectly, but completely. And for the first time since this began, Daniel Whitmore did not try to assert control. He did not interrupt, he did not redirect, because he was listening for something else, a gap, an error, a place where responsibility might split, where ownership might be shared. But it never came. Every answer circled back to the same point, the same name, the same signature, and somewhere beneath the calm surface he had built over years, something tightened, not panic, not yet, but the recognition that the structure he believed he controlled had already been redefined without his awareness. And across town, Naomi finally opened the envelope, removing a single document, placing it carefully on the table in front of her, not rushing, not hesitating, her eyes scanning the page once more, though she already knew every word by memory. Because this document was never meant to be hidden, it was meant to be revealed at exactly the right moment, a transfer record, clean, legal, irreversible, showing that months before the divorce, long before the final signatures, long before Daniel believed he was taking everything she had already moved, what mattered most, into a place he could not reach, could not claim, could not even see unless he knew where to look. And he never did, because he never had to question what he thought was his. And as Daniel stood in his own living room, surrounded by questions that no longer had simple answers, the final realization began to take shape, slowly, precisely the same way everything else had unfolded. This was not something that had happened to him. This was something he had stepped into willingly, because he believed it was a victory. And across the city, Naomi Carter leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unchanged, her hands resting lightly on the table, because the hardest part had never been proving anything. The hardest part had been waiting long enough for him to take it all on his own. "You should come in," Daniel Whitmore said finally, his voice steady but slower than usual as he stepped back from the doorway, because something in the air had already shifted from inquiry to inevitability, and he could feel it even if he could not yet fully name it. The kind of moment where control does not disappear, but quietly transfers to someone else without permission. And the people standing in his living room did not rush, they did not raise their voices, they simply moved through the space, with calm precision, referencing documents he now recognized line by line, transaction by transaction, entity by entity, each one tied directly to him, without interruption, without separation. And Daniel followed every word carefully, because he had built his life on understanding details, on staying ahead of every variable. But this time the details were not giving him control, they were removing it piece by piece, as each explanation closed off another path, another possibility, another assumption he had relied on. And across the city, Naomi Carter sat in that same quiet office, the light now softer as the afternoon stretched toward evening, her phone resting face down on the table beside the open document she had reviewed earlier, because she did not need updates, she did not need confirmation. Everything that mattered had already been set in motion, and what was happening now was simply the natural consequence of decisions made long before anyone else realized their weight. And back in the penthouse, Daniel's attorney arrived, breath slightly uneven, tie loosened just enough to signal urgency rather than composure in the moment. Their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, not panic, not yet, but alignment, the recognition that this situation was no longer theoretical, it was active, it was present, it was unfolding in real time. And the attorney began speaking, quickly outlining concerns, outlining exposure, outlining the reality that every structure Daniel had believed was protecting him was now functioning differently, because ownership had shifted completely, because there were no longer multiple names, no longer distributed responsibility, no longer any distance between the actions and the person now legally tied to them. And Daniel listened without interruption, his posture straight, his expression controlled, because losing composure would not change the facts, and he knew that better than anyone. But beneath that control, a new understanding was forming, not sudden, not dramatic, but precise and unavoidable. This was not a mistake, this was not an oversight, this was design, and the realization settled slowly but completely. Naomi had never fought for those assets because she had never needed to, she had never tried to keep them, because she had already separated what mattered from what did not. And what remained, what he had taken, what he had insisted on claiming, was something else entirely, something heavier, something that now sat fully in his hands with no way to divide it, no way to redirect it, no way to pretend it belonged to anyone else. And across town, Naomi finally turned her phone over, the screen lighting up with a single missed call she had expected, and she looked at it for a moment, not with satisfaction, but with recognition, because this was the exact point where understanding begins on the other side, where the person who believed they had control starts to see the structure for what it really is. And she did not call back, she did not respond, she simply let the moment exist, because there was nothing left to say, nothing left to explain. The truth was already doing its work. And back in the penthouse, Daniel Whitmore stood in the center of the room, no longer looking at the people around him, no longer focused on the documents spread across the table, but staring instead at a single realization that now felt undeniable. The question was no longer what had he taken, the question was why had she let him take it so easily. And for the first time since all of this began, he understood that the answer to that question was the only thing that mattered. The answer revealed itself not through words, but through sequence, because once Daniel Whitmore stopped asking what had gone wrong and started asking when it had been decided, everything began to align with a clarity that was almost unsettling, and he turned slowly toward his attorney, his voice quieter, now more controlled than before. When did she agree to full transfer, he asked, and the attorney hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because the question itself carried a different weight now. It was not about legal terms, it was about intention. It was during the second round of negotiations, the attorney replied, flipping through digital notes quickly. You remember, she declined joint ownership revisions, she said. She wanted a clean separation, no ongoing ties. And Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, not in frustration, but in recognition, because he did remember that moment. He remembered how easy it had felt, how convenient, how aligned with everything he wanted at the time, and more importantly, he remembered how he had not questioned it, not even once. And that was the detail that now stood out the most, not what she had done, but what he had failed to do, because control is not lost in a single moment, it is given away in a series of small decisions that seem harmless when they benefit you. And across the city, Naomi Carter stood at the edge of a quiet crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, the envelope still in her bag, the city moving around her in steady rhythm, cars passing, conversations blending into background noise, everything normal, everything unchanged except for the sequence unfolding just beneath the surface. And she stepped forward when the signal shifted, her pace, even her posture, reflecting the same quiet certainty she had carried since the beginning, because this was never about reacting, this was about allowing. And back in the penthouse, Daniel walked toward the desk again, but this time he was not searching, he was confirming, retracing each document, each signature, each agreement, not to understand the structure, but to understand the moment. He had stepped into it fully, and the pattern became undeniable. Every time there had been an opportunity to question, to pause, to reconsider, he had chosen not to, because it moved things forward, because it gave him more, because it made the outcome clearer in his favor. And now that same clarity was revealing something else entirely, that every layer he had trusted had been removed, not by force, not by deception, but by consent. His consent, and the weight of that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it could not be redirected, it could not be blamed on anyone else. It was his decision, his signature, his ownership in every sense of the word. and across town Naomi reached a building with no visible signage, entering, without hesitation, moving through a quiet lobby where no one stopped her, no one questioned her, because everything about her presence suggested purpose, and she made her way to a small office where a man stood as she entered, his posture professional, his expression neutral, and she placed the envelope on the desk between them, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just a simple movement that marked the next step in a process already set in motion months ago. And he opened it carefully, scanning the document, inside his eyes narrowing slightly as he reached the final line, and then he looked up at her, not surprised, but acknowledging something. Understood, this changes everything, he said quietly, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment before responding with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. It already did. And back in the penthouse, Daniel Whitmore stood alone, now the room quieter than before, the questions no longer being asked aloud, but echoing internally with a precision that left no space for denial. And he finally understood the answer to the question that had been forming since the courtroom, not why she had let him take everything, but how she had known he would, and that realization was the one thing he could not undo, because it meant that from the very beginning this had never been a negotiation, it had been a direction, and he had followed it exactly where it was meant to lead. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, Daniel Whitmore no longer felt like the owner of anything. He stood in a space filled with objects that legally belonged to him, yet none of it felt secure, not the glass walls, not the polished floors, not even the documents that had once represented control, because ownership without certainty is not power, it is exposure, and that truth was settling in with a precision he could not escape, and he moved slowly back toward the desk, his fingers brushing against the edge, as if grounding himself in something physical, something real, while his mind retraced every step that had led him here, not to change it, not to fix it, but to understand the exact moment. The outcome had become inevitable, and the answer was no longer hidden. It had been there in every quiet agreement, every time Naomi Carter had chosen not to argue, every time she had accepted terms that clearly favored him, every time she had stepped back instead of pushing forward, because he had interpreted that as weakness, as resignation, as surrender, when in reality it had been something else entirely. It had been direction. And across the city Naomi sat, across from the man in the office, the document now resting between them, no longer just paper, but confirmation of a line that had already been crossed months ago. And the man closed the folder carefully, his movements deliberate, as if acknowledging the weight of what he had just read. This will initiate a full review, he said calmly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a fact. And Naomi nodded once, not because she needed to hear it, but because she had expected it. Every part of this process had been calculated to reach that exact point, not sooner, not later, but exactly when ownership became absolute and responsibility could no longer be divided. And back in the penthouse, Daniel's phone buzzed again, another message, another request, another layer of pressure building, not from outside forces, but from the structure itself, now fully attached to him. And he picked up the phone, reading the notification slowly, this time not rushing, not reacting, just absorbing the reality that the questions were no longer about clarification, they were about accountability, and accountability has a different weight, because it does not ask what happened, it asks who is responsible. And the answer to that question was now printed across every document in the room, his name repeated again and again in places it had never been before, not because someone had forced it there, but because he had insisted on it, because he had believed that taking everything meant winning everything. And across town Naomi stood from her chair, the conversation finished, the next step already in motion, and she walked toward the door, without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her pace steady. Because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reveal. The structure was complete, the sequence was unfolding, and everything that followed would move on its own. And as Daniel Whitmore stood alone once more, the city lights reflecting against the glass around him, he finally understood something that had been hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. This was never about what she lost, this was about what he chose to take, and more importantly, what came with it. And in that realization, the last piece fell in a place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that left no room for denial. He had not just taken everything, he had accepted everything. And the difference between those two truths was the one thing he could never undo. The next shift did not arrive with noise or urgency, it arrived with confirmation. Because by the following morning, Daniel Whitmore was no longer questioning what had happened, he was watching it unfold in real time as calls turned into scheduled reviews, and reviews turned into formal processes that carried a weight he could not redirect, and he stood once again in his penthouse, but this time the space felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the meaning of everything inside it had been rewritten, and the documents on his desk were no longer something he needed to understand. They were something that now defined him legally, completely, and without separation. And when his attorney arrived again this time, there was no attempt to soften the conversation, no careful phrasing, no strategic optimism, only clarity. We need to prepare for a full examination of all associated entities, the attorney said, his tone steady but firm, and Daniel nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because he already knew there was no alternative. Every structure, every layer, every account now pointed directly to him, with no distance, no division, no shared responsibility. And across the city, Naomi Carter stepped out of a quiet building into the morning light, her movements unchanged, her pace steady, because everything that followed was no longer dependent on her actions. It was driven by the structure itself, and that had always been the goal, not to push, not to force, but to allow the system to reveal its own truth once the conditions were right. And back in the penthouse, Daniel moved toward the window, again the city stretching out below him, the same skyline, the same motion, the same world continuing forward, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because control is not defined by what you hold, it is defined by what you can separate from. And now there was nothing left to separate. Every element, every decision, every consequence was connected to him directly. And as another call came through, this time not from his attorney, but from a senior advisor whose voice carried a different tone, not urgent, not alarmed, but resolved. We need to assume full accountability for all operations going forward, the advisor said carefully, and Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, not to avoid the words, but to absorb them, because there was no room left for interpretation. The process had moved beyond questions, beyond analysis, into something final, something that no longer asked for understanding. It required acceptance. And across town, Naomi paused at a corner, briefly, her reflection catching in the glass of a storefront, and for a moment, she looked at herself, not with pride, not with relief, but with quiet certainty, because the hardest part had never been the planning, it had been the waiting, the patience required to let someone else walk willingly into the outcome they believed they controlled. And she continued walking without hesitation, without looking back, because there was nothing behind her that needed to be revisited. And back in the penthouse, Daniel Whitmore stood alone, once more the weight of the situation, no longer something forming, but something fully present and undeniable. And he finally understood the final piece of what had been set in motion months ago. This was never about taking anything from him. This was about giving him exactly what he demanded in its entirety, without filter, without protection, without division. And as that realization settled completely, the meaning of everything he had gained shifted permanently, because what he now held was not just ownership, it was consequence, and the two could no longer be separated. No matter how much he might want them to be, the final stage did not announce itself. It settled in quietly, like a weight that had always been there, but only now became impossible to ignore. And Daniel Whitmore sat at the long glass table in his penthouse, surrounded by advisors, legal documents, and a silence that no one attempted to break, because there was nothing left to debate, nothing left to negotiate, only facts that had already aligned themselves into a single unavoidable conclusion. And for the first time since this began, the conversation was no longer about structure or interpretation, it was about outcome, and the words were spoken carefully, deliberately, not to soften them, but to ensure there was no misunderstanding. Everything is now fully consolidated under your authority, which means every operational decision, every financial pathway, every prior action is directly attributable to you, the advisor said, and Daniel listened without interruption. His posture unchanged, his expression controlled, because reacting would not change what was already fixed in place. And across the city, Naomi Carter stepped into a quiet corridor, the sound of her footsteps steady against the polished floor, as she moved toward a final meeting, not to initiate anything new, but to confirm what had already been set in motion months ago. And when she entered the room, the same man from before was there, waiting, a thin file now placed on the table between them, thinner than before because the complexity had been reduced to clarity, and he slid it toward her without a word, and she opened it calmly, scanning the contents, her eyes moving across each line, each confirmation, each completed step, until she reached the final page, and paused, not because she was surprised, but because this was the exact moment she had calculated, the point where everything shifted from process to permanence, and she closed the file gently, her hand resting on it for a brief second before looking up and meeting his gaze, and he nodded once, not in approval, not in acknowledgement, but in recognition that the sequence was complete. And back in the penthouse, Daniel stood slowly, stepping away from the table, the conversation behind him continuing in low, measured tones. But he was no longer listening, because the answer he had been searching for had already been given, not through explanation, but through inevitability, and he walked toward the window again, the city below him unchanged and different too. The quiet collapse of certainty happening inside the space he once believed he controlled, and for the first time he allowed himself to see the entire picture, without interruption, without resistance from the beginning. This had never been about losing something for Naomi, it had been about isolating something for him, separating what held value from what carried weight, and then allowing him to claim it willingly, completely, without hesitation. And that was the part that settled deepest, because it meant there had never been a moment where he was forced into this outcome. There had only been moments where he chose it, where he insisted on it, where he believed it served him. And now, as everything aligned into a single undeniable reality, Daniel Whitmore understood that the most significant decision had not been made in the courtroom, or in the contracts, or in the negotiations. It had been made in the quiet spaces where he assumed control, without questioning what control actually meant. And across town, Naomi Carter stepped out of the building into the open air, the file no longer in her hands, because there was nothing left for her to carry. The process had completed itself exactly as intended, and she moved forward into the flow of the city without pause, without reflection, because there was nothing behind her that required it. And in that quiet movement, the final distinction became clear, not for her, but for him, that there is a difference between taking everything and understanding everything, and Daniel Whitmore had done the first completely, without ever realizing the cost of the second. By the time night settled over the city, the process was no longer something unfolding, it had become something defined, and Daniel Whitmore stood in the dim light of his penthouse, no longer surrounded by conversations, no longer guided by advisors, because the final stage does not require explanation, it requires acceptance. And the documents, now organized neatly on the table behind him, were no longer questions waiting to be answered, they were answers that could not be changed. And he remained still for a long moment, his reflection faint in the glass in front of him, not searching, not reacting, but recognizing the full shape of what had happened. Because for the first time since all of this began, there was nothing left to analyze, nothing left to uncover. Every detail, every decision, every consequence had aligned into a single clear truth, and that truth did not come with noise or drama, it came with clarity. He had not been outmaneuvered in a single move, he had been guided step by step through a process he believed he controlled, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it meant there had never been a point where he was unaware of his actions, only a point where he misunderstood their meaning. And across the city, Naomi Carter walked along a quiet street, the evening air cool, the movement of the city around her steady and unchanged. And there was no urgency in her steps, no hesitation, no need to look back, because everything behind her had already resolved itself, and everything ahead of her did not depend on what had happened, it depended on what she chose next. And that was the difference between them, not what they had gained or lost, but what they carried forward. And back in the penthouse, Daniel turned slowly from the window, his gaze moving across the room, not as an owner, but as someone seeing it for the first time, without assumption, without expectation, just reality. And he understood now that ownership, without separation, is not control, it is responsibility in its most complete form, and responsibility does not ask if you intended something, it does not consider what you believed at the time, it only reflects what is true, what is documented, what is attached to your name. And as that realization settled completely, there was nothing left to resist, nothing left to question, because the structure had already closed around him, not by force, not by deception, but by agreement, his agreement. And across town, Naomi paused briefly at the edge of a quiet intersection, the city lights reflecting softly against the pavement, and for a moment she stood there still, not thinking, not revisiting the past, but simply existing in the present, because the outcome had never been about watching anything fall apart, it had been about restoring balance, about ensuring that what was hidden no longer remained separate from the person who created it. And she stepped forward again, without hesitation, moving with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every stage of this process. And in that movement, the final contrast became undeniable. Daniel remained where everything had converged, surrounded by what he had chosen to take, while Naomi moved forward unburdened by what she had already left behind. And in that quiet separation, the true outcome revealed itself not as a moment of victory or defeat, but as a simple, undeniable fact that sometimes the most powerful act is not taking something away, it is allowing someone to hold everything they insisted on keeping until they understand exactly what it is worth. Morning returned without ceremony, and the city moved forward the way it always does, steady, indifferent, unchanged, and Daniel Whitmore stood in the same place he had been the night before, but something fundamental had shifted, not in the world around him, but in the way he now understood his place within it, because there were no more calls to take, no more documents to review, no more strategies to consider. Everything had already been defined, and what remained was not a situation to manage but a reality to accept. And he walked slowly through the space that had once represented success, each step measured, each movement quiet, not because he was defeated, but because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to control. The illusion had dissolved completely, leaving only structure, only consequence, only the undeniable link between his choices and their outcomes. And across the city, Naomi Carter stepped into a new morning with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, her path no longer intersecting with what had been left behind, not because she had escaped it, but because she had already resolved it in a way that required no further action, no explanation, no return. And she paused briefly outside a small cafe, the door opening, as someone stepped out, the scent of coffee drifting into the air, a simple, ordinary moment, untouched by everything that had unfolded. And she allowed herself to stand there for a second, not reflecting, not revisiting, just existing in a space that was entirely her own, because that had always been the goal, not to take anything from someone else, but to reclaim what could not be taken in the first place. And back in the penthouse, Daniel reached the window, once more the skyline stretching endlessly before him, the same view that had once symbolized expansion, opportunity, control, and now it remained exactly the same, unchanged by his understanding, yet entirely different in meaning, because ownership had not given him freedom, it had defined his limits, and he understood now, with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, that there is a difference between acquiring something and carrying it, and he had not prepared for the weight of what he chose to carry, and that was the part that could not be reversed, not the documents, not the signatures, not the structure itself, but the fact that it had all been accepted willingly, without question, because it served him at the time. And as that realization settled completely, there was no anger, no resistance, no attempt to rewrite what had already been written, only a quiet recognition that the outcome had never been hidden, it had only been misunderstood. And across town, Naomi Carter stepped forward. Again, the city opening around her, her movement steady, her expression unchanged, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reveal. The sequence had completed itself exactly as intended. And in that quiet continuation, the final truth remained simple and undeniable, that sometimes the most decisive moment is not when something is taken away, but when someone is given exactly what they asked for in full, and only later understands what it truly means to keep it.